And in continuation of my lecture, I am today going to take one particular provision of law, that is Order 8 Rule 6A. Order 8 speaks about written statements. Written statement is also part of the pleadings along with the plaint. And there are various subsections or sub-rules dealing with what are the claims that can be made and what are the pleadings that could be made is the subject of our discussion today. Sub-rule 6A of Order 8 deals with the scope of set-off, the right to claim set-off, and also the right to claim counterclaim. I have in the last class told you that there are certain cases only in respect of which, or in those cases, set-off or this counterclaim can be asked for, can be claimed. Set-off can be asked for in a suit which is dealing with only a money claim. Set-off can be asked for only in a money claim, and that too, the cause of action should have arisen in the very same suit or in the subject of the very same suit. Otherwise, set-off cannot be asked for. But in counterclaim, according to Rule 6A, it can be asked for even in respect of a different cause of action, which has given rise to a right as against the plaintiff who has filed the suit. Therefore, based on a different cause of action also, if anything is due, any right can be asked for from the plaintiff, that can be set up along with the defense by way of a counterclaim in the very same written statement. And now, Rule 6A, I am going to discuss about the scope. Now, formally, there was an assumption that in respect of money suit alone, this counterclaim can be asked. But now, after an amendment that has been carried out, that is by way of CPC Amendment Act 1976, now the scope has been widened. Even in cases which has been filed for different reliefs other than money claim, a counterclaim or a set-off can be asked for in the written statement. And what is the time limit a defendant has to set up that counterclaim or set-off? But one condition being that the cause of action for the counterclaim or set-off should have arisen before the written statement, or a little longer time also, or the time that is provided for filing written statement is also the time limit. Not only suppose if the written statement is filed on the date of expiry of the time limit for filing written statement, that is the time limit before which this cause of action should have arisen. Suppose if the written statement is filed earlier, before the expiry of the time limit given for filing written statement, and later on there is some more time, and during that time also, if anything happens by reason of which a cause of action arises, which gives rise to a claim for a counterclaim against the plaintiff, that time limit also can be taken as time limit for filing counterclaim. Therefore, only criteria being that the cause of action should have arisen before the time limit given for filing written statement. Therefore, that alone is the criteria. Therefore, that is the criteria, and if such a claim is asked for, it is permissible. Now, this scope of Rule 6A is discussed in a decision reported in AR 1987, Supreme Court, page 1395. And also another case on the subject is 2012 4 CTC 807. These are two important case laws on this topic. And in respect of counterclaim, the defendant should state exactly what he wants. He must be specific. It should not be vague. Therefore, it has to be stated in clear terms what his claim is. Otherwise, if it is vague, the court will not entertain such counterclaim. That is stated in sub rule 6A. And according to section 6C, capital C, the plaintiff can always object the introduction of a counterclaim in the written statement, saying that this counterclaim could not be asked for in this written statement or in respect of the claim made by him in the suit. He can oppose at the moment when such written statement is filed. The court can render a verdict on such objection and pass an order accordingly. Therefore, it has to be objected to by the plaintiff at the earliest when the written statement is filed. Otherwise, it will continue to remain in the written statement, and it also will form part of the subject matter of the decision by the court. Therefore, the objection with regard to the permissibility of raising a counterclaim should be made at the outset when the written statement is attempted to be filed along with the counterclaim. That is 6C. And this counterclaim should be, the objection should be made before settlement of issues. If issues are settled on the basis of the written statement with the counterclaim, then the counterclaim cannot be objected to. Therefore, before settlement of issue, the counterclaim raised by the defendant should be objected to by the plaintiff. Otherwise, the time given to him or the right to given him is lost. And 6D. This is also, I remember having said in the last class, suppose if the suit is dismissed, where in the written statement a counterclaim has been made, or if the suit is stayed, or if the suit is even discontinued by the plaintiff, what will happen to the counterclaim made in the written statement? According to 6D, sub-rule 6D, the claim put forward as counterclaim by the defendant will continue to remain as a suit. As I said, this counterclaim will be tried as a cross suit. Instead of forcing the defendant to file a separate suit, this opportunity is given in the CPC. Therefore, it will be treated as a different suit. That is called cross suit. And this cross suit will be tried just like any other ordinary suit, irrespective of whether the main suit filed by the plaintiff is stayed or dismissed or even discontinued by the party, by the plaintiff. And even if it is stayed by a higher court, this counterclaim has to be tried as a separate suit. That is 6D. Then 6C. 6C says, suppose if the plaintiff does not file a written statement, but this is an anomaly I have brought to your notice in the last class. Even the plaintiff is now permitted to file a written statement. It may look anomalous, but it is true. Plaintiff has to file a written statement in his own suit. Normally, the defendant is required to file written statement. But this anomalous position created under section sub-rule 6E is that the plaintiff has to file a written statement in the counterclaim filed by the defendant, as if he is the defendant in the counterclaim and as if he is the defendant in the suit. Therefore, he has to file a written statement to the. If he does not object, then that will be decreed. The counterclaim raised by the defendant will be decreed if no objection in the written statement is, if no written statement is filed raising any objection to the counterclaim. Otherwise, the cross suit will be decreed. Then 6F. 6F says, then whoever is entitled to the excess. Suppose if the counterclaim says this much amount, the plaintiff says this much amount, there's a difference. And the court will decide who is entitled to that amount. If the amount decreed in favor of the plaintiff exceeds the claim made by the plaintiff, then in respect of the excess amount, the suit will be decreed in favor of the plaintiff. And for the excess, suppose if it is decreed in favor of the plaintiff, then that excess will be decreed in favor of the plaintiff, deducting the amount representing the counterclaim made by the defendant. That is 6E. Then next important provision in CPC is Order 8 capital A, order 8 capital A. This is called third party procedure. What is the third party procedure? Third party procedure is nothing. It is a third party notice. A party who is not a party, or a person who is not a party in the suit will be made a party. How? This is by third party procedure. A third person who is a stranger to the suit will be brought in as a party in the suit. That is called a third party procedure. And it is otherwise called also by third party notice, a third person is being brought in as a party to the suit. That is spoken of in order 8 rule A, capital A. Here, how, when a third person is brought in as a party. Suppose the plaintiff files a suit against the defendant for a, say for example, a money claim. But this money claim has to be satisfied by a third party. As far as the defendant is concerned, if any decree is passed against the defendant, original defendant, and that money, according to the defendant, has to be defrayed or contributed by a third person, then the third person can be brought in by the defendant. In case a decree is passed against the defendant, that liability to pay or satisfy the decree will be passed on to the third party. Therefore, this procedure has been given so that multiplicity of proceeding is avoided. Multiplicity of proceedings in the sense, suppose a money decree is obtained as against the defendant. Necessarily, defendant has a claim in respect of that decree that is passed in favor of the plaintiff as against the third party. Definitely, he has to get contribution from the third party. Therefore, instead of forcing the defendant to file another suit as against the third party for the very same claim, now the CPC provides a simple procedure so that that party also will be brought in and a compendious decision can be arrived at. And that will avoid a second suit being filed by the defendant against the third party. And also it will avoid conflict of the decisions also. Suppose an anomalous position will be created in case the defendant's claim as against the defendant is negative. Then what will happen? But otherwise, this decree would have been obtained, this decree would have been satisfied by the defendant as against the third defendant, as against the party who is brought in as a defendant. Therefore, instead of avoiding or circumventing such contingencies, this procedure is being adopted and permission is given under Order 8 Rule A. This is third party procedure. And what are the occasions on which these contingencies will arise? Suppose take for example, suppose it's an insurance case. This third party might have given a guarantee in favor of the defendant and third party. And this indemnity or guarantee or indemnity, in case you incur any liability as against a third person who is the plaintiff, who can be taken as a plaintiff, and in case any decree or order is passed for payment of any money, then I will stand guarantee for the amount that is decreed in favor of the plaintiff or a claimant. Therefore, it will arise by way of a special contract or an indemnity bond or by operation of law and also by a special statute. State for example, an insurance act. And you know that every vehicle has to be insured. Private vehicle has to be insured with an insurance as against the claim of the third party. The car owner will ride his car and may cause an accident, causing injury to a third person. And special requirement by a law is that a special vehicle should be insured for third party insurance or to meet against the contingency of claim made by an injured person. Therefore, he can enter into a contract with the insurance company and get a policy. This policy is compulsory. And in case the insurer is not implicated as a party and the vehicle owner alone is proceeded against in a suit, claiming compensation for the injury caused to the plaintiff as a result of accident caused by the vehicle, driven by the owner or his employee, then definitely he can file a suit against the car owner or vehicle owner. But the vehicle owner in turn can claim the amount because of the indemnity or guarantee given by the insurer as per the policy of insurance. But if that insurer is omitted to be implemented, then the defendant can say, yes, as per a special contract between me and also the insurance has given a guarantee or an indemnity. Therefore, the insurance company should be implemented as a party. Therefore, in such cases, the defendant has to send a notice with the permission of the court to the third party, saying all these details that the insurance company is liable or a third party is liable. Therefore, that notice is called third party notice. Suppose in case the third party doesn't appear even after the notice issued by the defendant with the permission of the court, then whatever decree that is passed against the defendant will be passed on to the third party insurer. Therefore, the third party insurer, if it doesn't come into the scene or has not ended appearance in the court, then the decree will be executed against the third party as if it is executed against the, or instead of being executed against the original defendant. Therefore, third party notice, if one received, then definitely he has to enter appearance and defend his claim. And this third party has given liberty to question not only the original liability between the plaintiff and the defendant, and also between the defendant also and the third party. Therefore, the scope of his defense is wider. Not only question the liability as against the plaintiff by the defendant, and also by the third party as against the defendant and also the plaintiff. Therefore, his right is wider. He can question the liability both ways, as against the plaintiff and also as against the defendant. But in case he doesn't appear, then he has to take the risk of being executed or being that a decree being passed, and that decree will be levied against that third party as if he is the original defendant. And here also I have said the object being to avoid multiplicity of proceedings, and a right to indemnify may arise from express contract or from some statute. Then in respect of money claims, sometimes apart from this insurance claim, money claim also may arise, in which the suit filed by the plaintiff against the defendant is entitled to contribution from others also. He may not be the only party in respect of the claim, or liable to pay the liable to satisfy the decree that may be passed against him. There may be other person also. In case a person alone is proceeded against, he can bring in the other person who is also equally liable in respect of the suit filed by the plaintiff. Suppose if the whole entire amount is sought to be recovered by way of a suit from a single defendant, and if the defendant says that apart from myself, there are other persons also in respect of this same cause of action, others are also liable. Therefore, they are also liable to contribute the amount that may be decreed. Then he can, with the permission of the court, send notice to the other parties and bring them as a defendants in the suit. That is called third party notice. Here there is a case law. I will give the citation a little later, but I will explain the contents of that decision. In a suit filed by a plaintiff against the partnership firm with one or two partners as parties. You know, though the partnership firm is a juristic person, but in the eye of law, all the partners together will constitute the partnership firm. Therefore, it is expected that all the partners should be implemented as a party apart from that partnership firm. But a suit filed against the partnership alone is also maintainable. But here a question will arise later that I am not liable. Other partners who are not made party in the suit may set up a defense saying that I am not liable. Therefore, in order to avoid such a contingency, if a suit is filed against the partnership firm with one or two partners. When there are several partners, then those partners who are made parties in the suit can say that there are other partners also who are equally liable to pay the amount in case the suit is decreed. Then other partners can also be brought in by way of this third party notice. Therefore, this third party notice has to be sent to other partners also with the permission of the court. That this illustration I have given is the subject matter of a case that is reported in 1982, 1 MLJ, page 105. The equivalent is AR 1982, Madras 242, and Order 8, capital A, Sub-Rule 2 speaks about the effect of notice. As I already said, when a notice is issued to a third party, and if the third party doesn't come forward to get implicated in the party, then he stands the risk of a decree being passed against him. And for all practical purposes, the third party who has received notice under this particular provision will be treated as a party in the suit, also as a defendant in the suit. Therefore, if any decree is passed against the defendant, it will be binding on the third party also who has received notice from the plaintiff. This principle is also subject matter of one or two suits, one or two cases reported in 2012, 1 CTC 589, a division bench judgment of our Honorable High Court. 2012, 1 CTC 589. And another case is 1961, 2 MLJ 335. It is equivalent to 1961 Madras, AAR 1961 Madras, page 367. These three case laws deal with this subject. And then I already told you there are certain consequences that will flow or that will befall on the third party to whom a notice has been sent. That consequence is dealt with under subclass 3 of Order 8A, capital A. You kindly read that particular provision, which I have already explained to you. What will be the consequence? Decree will be passed against the third party. That is the risk. And next is Order 9. Order 9 is usually we come across during our profession as advocate. This is relating to service of notice. The plaintiff has to take summons to the defendant. That is spoken of in Order 9, Rule 1. And on summons being received by the defendant should enter appearance either in person or through a counsel appointed him or engaged by him. That is Order 9, Rule 1. And then as soon as the defendant receives summons from the court in the suit filed by the plaintiff, he is expected or he is not expected, he is required to appear before court on the day fixed by the court in the summons. Therefore, in the summons also, there will be a provision. Either he can appear in person or through a counsel. Therefore, either appearance is enough on the day fixed. Suppose where on the day fixed, it is found summons not served. Suppose on the next day also fixed for appearance of the defendant. In case it is found that the plaintiff has not taken steps by way of filing the required court fee or by way of depositing the expenses for the service, and if the plaintiff has not done so, then the suit will be dismissed. On the next date of hearing, if it is found that the plaintiff has committed default without paying the court fee, required court fee, and also the cost of the summons, then it will be dismissed. But one concession being, suppose in case the defendant getting knowledge of the suit appears on the day, then notwithstanding the default of the plaintiff, then it will be taken as if the suit is maintainable and the plaintiff has not committed any default. But the entrance of or the entry of the defendant as in the suit will be recorded. Therefore, if the defendant appears, the defect will be cured, automatically cured, though the requisite court fee and cost not paid by the plaintiff. And sub rule 3, order 9. Suppose on the day fixed in the summons, both the plaintiff and also the defendant does not appear, then the suit will be dismissed. Therefore, he has to take the risk. The plaintiff has to take the risk. Suppose if the plaintiff doesn't appear and also the defendant appears, in the earlier provision, if the defendant appears, the defect will be cured. But in the next provision, suppose on the day fixed, both the parties not present, then the suit will be dismissed. That is sub rule 3. And if the suit is dismissed on either of the contingencies, either non-appearance of parties or the defect of the default of payment of required court fee by the plaintiff, if the suit is dismissed, then it can be restored by filing proper application. But fresh suit can also be filed. In case the suit is dismissed for the default of the plaintiff in payment of the court fee, required court fee, and also the cost. And also under class 3, if both the parties not present and the suit came to be dismissed, in both the cases, either the suit can be restored by filing proper application or by filing a fresh suit also. It is permissible. Then 5 not necessary. 6, subclass 6, and where the plaintiff appears and the defendant does not appear, and when the suit is called on for hearing, what is the course open to the court? Suppose on the day fixed in the summons, the defendant does not turn up, then what will be the courts open? Suppose if he doesn't appear, then court will set him ex parte. The court will set him ex parte. Suppose in the summons a date is given and the summons has not been served before the date fixed for hearing, then also the court will direct the plaintiff to take fresh summons to the defendant. And in that occasion, the plaintiff has to take one more summons to the defendant, and the defendant is required to attend on the next date of hearing. Therefore, the court will see whether summons has been served well in advance or prior to the date fixed for the hearing. And second summons is permitted. And the court will postpone the hearing of the suit till the summons is served on the defendant. But in cases wherein a defendant is set ex parte and the court can hear the case from the next hearing onwards in the absence of the defendant because he has been served. In those cases, the case will be adjourned. The defendant will be set ex parte, case will be adjourned. On the adjourned date, if the defendant appears and explains to the court why he could not be present on the earlier date, and if he gives a sufficient reason, the court will condone his absence on the earlier date and also set aside that order setting him ex parte. That is provided under sub rule 7 of order 9. And suppose if the defendant appears and the plaintiff is not present, then as I already told you, the suit will be dismissed. And here also one exception is given. Just like in the earlier case, the earlier provision, that is sub rule 3, even if the plaintiff has not cured the defect, in the sense that paying the requisite court fee and also the cost, and if the defendant does not come, that will be dismissed. But if the defendant appears, that defect will be cured. Likewise, here also, if the plaintiff is absent, if the defendant appears, and the plaintiff is not present, the suit will be dismissed for default. But here, if the defendant admits his claim, the plaintiff is not, you please visualize the situation. The defendant has appeared in response to the summons. Plaintiff has not appeared, then the result will be, the suit will be dismissed. But here the exception being, the defendant comes and admits his claim, admits the claim of the plaintiff, then also it will save the suit from being dismissed. This is exception. If the defendant appears, but also admits the claim made in the plaint, then the suit will be decreed, notwithstanding the absence of the plaintiff. That is spoken of in sub-rule 8 of Order 9. Then sub-rule 9 says, where a suit is dismissed under Rule 8, the plaintiff will be precluded from bringing a fresh suit in respect of this same cause of action, but he may apply for an order to set aside the dismissal aside sufficient cause shown. Therefore, in case the suit is dismissed for default for the appearance of the plaintiff, then a petition can be filed to set aside that order of dismissal. But here one exception, you have to take note that in case the plaintiff fails to file an application to set aside that order of dismissal, then he is not permitted to file a fresh suit. In the earlier provision, he is permitted to file fresh suit, notwithstanding the dismissal of his suit. But under this provision, if the suit is dismissed under subclause 8 of Order 9, then there is no right of filing a fresh suit. But the right that is given to the plaintiff is to file an application, appropriate application for setting aside that order of dismissal and for restoration. He is given right to file an application for restoration of his suit which was dismissed for default. Therefore, if the plaintiff fails to file an application under Order 9, Rule 9, then he will be debarred from filing a fresh suit. Then, when there are several plaintiffs who have filed a suit against some of the defendants, and some of the plaintiffs have not appeared. But of course, these are all exceptional cases mentioned in this particular provision, because almost all cases, all the plaintiffs are represented by only one advocate. A same advocate will appear for all the plaintiffs. Therefore, this question will not arise once an Wakarat is filed. But if different persons are appearing, or different advocates are appearing for different plaintiffs in a suit, an occasion may arise. There may be, after filing the suit, there may arise a dispute between the plaintiffs. In such of those cases, the plaintiff or some of the plaintiffs will engage another lawyer also. In such of those cases, if the defendant, some of the defendant do not appear in the court in response to the summons, then the court will set them ex parte and proceed with the case as if all the plaintiffs are present. All the plaintiffs are present. The court is given the liberty either to pass a decree. I will come a little later, but I am a little bit confused. But here, the court will proceed as if all the plaintiffs are present. And if one or two of the plaintiffs are not present, the court will proceed with the plaintiffs or with the plaintiffs who are present as if all the plaintiffs are present. Then non-attendance of one or two defendants. If there are several defendants and one or two defendants alone present, then the court has been given a discretion to pass orders, either to pass order setting them ex parte, and after setting them ex parte, then before the trial is commenced, the suit can be decreed as against those defendants who did not appear also. But it is the discretion of the court. Either the court can reserve a decree or passing a decree as against the defendants who are not present to the conclusion of the trial till the trial is concluded, and pass a decree compendiously as against all the defendants together in the suit, or it can exercise a discretion, a sound discretion. In case it is plausible, then it can pass a decree as against the defendants who are declared absent or who are declared ex parte. But it is the discretion of the court. But normally the court will reserve decree compendiously after the conclusion of the trial. And that is spoken of in the sub-rule 11 of Order 9. And setting aside, order 13 speaks about you once a decree is passed, ex parte, against the defendants, those defendants have a liberty to file an application to get that decree, ex parte decree, set aside. That is provided under Order 9, Rule, Sub-Rule 13. This is provided for setting aside. But here, reason or the grounds on which such an application can be filed is enumerated. That is, suppose if the summons not duly served, it can also be taken as a ground for setting aside that ex parte decree. Suppose saying that the summons have not been served and therefore the defendant could not appear before the court on the particular date. Because of his absence on that day, the suit was decreed ex parte. This may be one of the reasons. And another is other sufficient cause. If any sufficient cause is also shown that the particular defendant is prevented from appearing before court on that day fixed in the summons, that is also a sufficient reason or adequate reason is given. Then also the suit can be and the decree can be set aside. That is called prevented by sufficient cause. If defendant is prevented by sufficient cause, and also other reason, strong reason is that the summons has not been served in time. These are all two grounds on which the court will set aside the ex parte decree on its satisfaction. And one exception being, I have already explained to you about this aspect in the earlier class, that in case an ex parte decree, against an ex parte decree, an appeal has been filed. Appeal is also permitted. And if an appeal is filed earlier and that appeal has been dismissed on merit after hearing both the parties, then the defendant is not given a liberty to file the application for setting aside. But one condition being, if the appeal is withdrawn by the appellant, that is the defendant, before that is decided in the appellate court, then in those circumstances, the defendant is given liberty to file an application for setting aside that ex parte decree. If appeal filed and the decision rendered on merit, then no right of filing a petition for setting aside. Suppose if the appeal is withdrawn by the defendant and the defendant comes back to the trial court seeking to set aside that ex parte decree, that is permitted. These are all spoken in Order 9, Rule 13. And Order 13. Order 13 is an important provision of law provided in CPC. Here, when the document has to be filed, after the parties have filed their pleadings and also issues framed, then the question will arise, the evidence has to be produced. Evidence in the form of documents have to be produced by both the parties. The court will permit both the parties to file their documents in their custody so as to arrive at a proper decision. Therefore, that is spoken of in Order 13 of CPC, production, impounding, and return of documents. Here the parties or their pleader shall produce on or before the settlement, of issues, but not afterwards, on or before the settlement of issues, all the documentary evidence in original, where the copies thereof have been filed along with the plaintiff. Here, in most of the cases, the parties may not come with the originals. The parties will approach the advocate or the lawyer, instructing them to file a suit, giving all instructions. But the documents they possess at that time is only the copies, mostly Xerox copies. The lawyers will draft the plaint and file the suit with all the Xerox copies or copies of the original documents. The original documents will not be filed at the time when they file this suit. But the court will not, under this rule, will not permit production of copies. But the court will require either certified copies of the original documents or the original documents alone. Therefore, when it comes up for trial and when it is going to be produced as an exhibit or as an evidence, the court will require the plaintiff or the defendant to file the original only. Therefore, unless original is filed, that document will not be considered at all as an evidence. And these condition is relaxed on one occasion or in one or two occasions. Suppose a document can be kept separately by the lawyer or the party, but these document can be produced at the time of cross-examination of the other party. Suppose to confront him. In cases wherein the parties want to confront the witness by a surprise production of a document, a genuine document, the court will permit without being produced at the time of filing the suit or filing the written statement. Therefore, that is permitted. That can be kept aside and brought on the day when the examination of parties have commenced. Therefore, court will permit. That another occasion will be to refresh the memory of the witness also. Suppose if the court permits, these documents can be shown with the permission of the court to the witness for refreshing the memory. In those cases, any document, though not listed and though not produced before the settlement of issues, can be allowed to be brought in only for the purpose of refreshing the memory and also for confronting a witness who is not telling the truth or who is telling a fact which is contrary to truth. Then in those cases, the court will permit the other side to bring that document in order to confront the witness, in order to prove the falsity of his evidence that is being tendered before the court. These are two occasions. And what are the documents the court will accept? The court will accept only relevant and admissible documents. Relevant, not all the documents. Therefore, before court accepts the document, before the settlement of issues, the court will see whether these documents are admissible in law or whether these documents are necessary or material for the disposal of the case. If the documents are irrelevant, the court will at the outset reject the attempt on the part of the party to produce those documents. Therefore, the court will not entertain those applications. And suppose whether a document which is inadmissible in law can be produced. This is a question that is always confronting a court, whether inadmissible evidence can be produced. And if it is rightly or wrongly, it has been admitted as evidence, whether that admissibility of the document can be questioned. Here, two aspects of the issue. Suppose if a document is wholly inadmissible, you may have come across what is called in legal parlance primary evidence and also secondary evidence. Primary evidence is given under section 62 of the Indian Evidence Act. Secondary evidence is spoken of in section 63 of the Evidence Act. Kindly take note these two sections. In order to understand better these provision, that is order 13 regarding production of documents, the court or even the advocates will be confronted with a dilemma about the legal aspects. Therefore, you have to first of all take into account or understand what is the primary evidence and also the secondary evidence. If you understand thoroughly section 62 and section 63 of the Evidence Act, then you can deal with this problem that may arise when you produce those documents in court. The primary evidence is nothing but the original itself. And the secondary evidence is nothing but the copy, the true copy of the original evidence. Suppose the original evidence is nothing but it is the evidence, the court will rely on it for the claim that is made in the suit. Suppose a sale deed. If the original of the sale deed is produced before the court will take it that the plaintiff is the owner, absolute owner of the property. Therefore, the court does not require any other evidence. It is the primary evidence. Suppose if you file a copy, not the primary evidence or not the original sale deed, but if you produce produce another copy, but the copy should be certified. If the certified copy is produced, that a copy certified by a competent authority is produced before court, it will be treated as a secondary evidence. Therefore, secondary evidence is also admissible. Therefore, the document should be either primary or secondary. Apart from these two documents, no document will be permitted to be produced as evidence. Therefore, any other evidence apart from these primary and the secondary evidence is sought to be produced, the court will not accept it. It will not be admitted as evidence. But here also, these evidences will be divided into two classes. I will deal with now. Now, what will be the responsibility of the judge? Suppose if documents are filed and the documents are admissible, say for example, it is admissible, and relevancy is also admitted. Relevancy is also admitted. The court has to satisfy itself whether at the outset these documents are to be produced is admissible, relevant, and also material for the disposal of the case. The court will accept it. But on accepting it, the court has to do these following discharge the following responsibility. One is, when admitted in evidence, the following particulars must be noted. That is Order 13, Sub-Rule 4. There will be a docket in every document. There will be a docket, and on the docket, the court or the judge is empowered to make endorsements. And when he receives that document, after all these formalities over, then he has to write down the number and title of the suit. Second, name of the persons who has produced that document. Suppose if the plaintiff produces that document, the court will say produced by the plaintiff. And the next, the date of production of such a document, that will also be there. And there will be a statement saying that this document has been admitted in evidence. Not admitted not as evidence, admitted in evidence. There are a subtle difference. Admitted as evidence is different, and admitted in evidence is different. Therefore, kindly take note. It is admitted because it is an admissible document. And what is the next next responsibility that lies on the plaintiff or the person who produces the document? I will explain to you a little later. Therefore, the fourth condition being, the court should say that it is being admitted. Therefore, these four particulars should find a place in the endorsement made by the judge. There is an endorsement. And whenever these documents are sought to be here, therefore, this is some practical advantage. You have to study this very, very deeply, very minutely, so that whenever a document is filed, it is not a simple affair. That requires a hard understanding of the subtle issues or subtle legal position of law. Therefore, whenever a document is sought to be produced, it can be objected to by the other side, either saying it is not admissible, it is not relevant, it is not material. Therefore, then and there, when the document is sought to be produced, the other party against whom such a document is produced have a right to oppose the production of that document. Therefore, that is the relevant time. You have to be very careful for objecting to the production of that document. If you lose that opportunity, it may be a fatal miss. Thereafter, you may not get a chance to oppose the production of that document. Once produced, that will form part of the record. The court will look into it if it is relevant. Therefore, at the threshold itself, when it is sought to be produced, you have to object to it. That is the time. Therefore, that is sub-rule 4. An objection to the admissibility of the document should be raised before such endorsement is made, before the judge makes that endorsement, that 4 conditions. And before that endorsement is made, one has to object. The court will render its verdict then and there, on the spot. And if he is aggrieved, then it can be taken in appeal. Because the question is whether the person against whom that document is sought to be produced has objected to it. If he has failed to object to it, then the question of admissibility will not be taken as a reason for opposing it at an earlier stage. Therefore, that is the time. And the objection as to admissibility of documents in the evidence may be classified into two classes. Suppose, as I have said to you, admissibility of document and also mode of proof. Suppose one document is not admissible, and if this is also divided into 2 categories of classes. One is admissibility of document and another is mode of proof. Suppose admissibility of document is relating to the document cannot be admitted because either it is not a primary document or a secondary document. That's primary evidence or secondary evidence. The opposite party can always object to it. But if it is not admissible in evidence, it is not admissible in evidence forever. Here, even a carelessness will not render the objection fatal or render the plaintiff's right fatal. The right to oppose that inadmissible document or the production of inadmissible document is always there at any stage of the proceedings. Even if the opposite party fails to oppose it, it can be raised as an objection even at a later stage, questioning the admissibility of the document, even at appellate stage also. Even in appeal, that objection can be canvassed, saying that inadmissible document has been admitted under this provision, order 13 rule 4. The court ought not to have entertained this document. This question can be raised. But in cases which relates to or which involves the production of a document connected with mode of proof. Suppose if a document is filed with insufficient with insufficient court fee, there are certain documents which has to be filed only by affixing stamps only. Unstamped document will not be permitted. In such of those cases, you have to classify into 2 categories. One, admissibility of document. If inadmissible, it is always inadmissible forever. You can always object. Even carelessness can be cured. But in case of producing document concerning mode of proof, in the case of suppose a document which is sought to be produced lacks a sufficient stamp. Suppose if the stamp is not provided or affixed sufficiently, then in those cases, which is otherwise admissible, if the stamp is properly affixed, that the evidence will be admissible. But in the absence of that requisite stamp on that document, it may not be admissible. But in those cases, you have to object to the production of that document then and there itself when it is sought to be produced. In case the other party fails to oppose it, then it is fatal. That question cannot be raised at all. If the document concerning mode of proof, just like in the case of division stamps, then this question cannot be raised at a later stage. You should have raised that objection at the time when the document is produced, because this provision is given based on fair play. The court says it is a fair play. You have to oppose it then and there when it is sought to be produced. Suppose insufficient document, insufficiently stamped document is produced. If there is nobody to oppose that production of the document, it will form part of the record. It will be admitted as a document and it will be made an exhibit. What we call, you all know, in legal parlance, exhibit A, exhibit D, the exhibit B. If the document is produced by the plaintiff, it will be called Exhibit A, and by the plaintiff, it will be called Exhibit B. Chadanappa? Exhibit B. Therefore, in cases which where a document which is otherwise admissible on but for the stamp, sufficient stamp, then objection should be made there itself. In case it is based on fair play. What is the fair play that is involved here? Fair play means, suppose if the sufficient stamp is not there in the particular document, then the objector has to say that stamp has not been properly affixed. The sufficient stamp is not there. Therefore, don't admit it. The court may say, yes, stamp is inadequate. Therefore, this document cannot be marked. Then, in those cases, the court will take a decision on the spot itself. Then by that order, if he is aggrieved, the person who produced the document will set right by providing the deficiency or recouping the deficiency. He can file the very same document on the next occasion. Therefore, you are giving a chance to the other party to make good that deficiency by pointing out as an objection at the time when it is produced. Therefore, in case you fail to produce it, then the court will be under the impression, or the party who has produced the document will be under the impression that the other party is not serious about the deficiency of the stamp. The deficiency of the stamp. Therefore, you have to give him an opportunity. Only when you object at the time when it is filed, you are giving an opportunity to the other side to make good. Therefore, it is a question of fair play. Therefore, the court has come to the conclusion, in such of those cases, if objection is not made at the time when the document is produced, then you have lost the opportunity to oppose it at a later stage. That document will be marked, notwithstanding the deficiency of stamp in the document. Therefore, it relates to mode of proof. In cases when a document is produced relating to mode of proof, then if it is not objected to in proper time, at the time when it is produced, then the other party will lose his chance to oppose that admissibility of the document at a later stage. But in the other case, by inadmissible document, if it is either not primary or not secondary, then the other documents is not admissible at all forever. Therefore, it can be taken as an objection anytime after the production of the document also, even at upper late stage. And then I have told you that this proposition of law is based on rule of fair play. Is a rule of fair play. And the crucial test is whether an objection, if taken at the appropriate point of time, would have enabled the party tendering the evidence to cure the defect and resort to such a mode of proof as would be regular. The omission to object becomes fatal because by his failure, the party entitled to object allows the party tendering the evidence to act on an assumption that the opposite party is not serious about the mode of proof. In those cases, that evidence will be accepted. On the other hand, a prompt objection on the part of the other side does not prejudice the party tendering the evidence. He has the opportunity to set right the mode of proof. Then this is explained in a case decided in 2003 8 SEC 752. This is an elaborate judgment rendered on this topic. Kindly go through this document. Go through this decision. It's an elaborate judgment on this topic. If you read and if you understand properly, it will stand you in good stead in your profession. Kindly take note. I am repeating it once over again. 2003 8 SEC. Madam, sound, I am hearing other sounds also.
I'll see, sir, if anyone else is open.
No, but my lecture is being
Yes, sir.
External
1 second, sir. I'll mute.
Noises.
Yes, sir. Someone has opened the mic. Sorry, sir.
Yeah, yes. Sir, kindly take down this important case law which will throw light on all the aspects relating to the production of documents, and also the inadmissibility or otherwise of a document, and also the stage at which the production of this document has to be objected to, are elaborately discussed in the decision reported in 2003 8 SEC page 752. And in that judgment, a reference is also made. This is also that reference is AR 1966, Supreme Court 1457. They have to kindly read both the decision together for a fuller understanding of this aspect, legal aspect. And what will happen in case the documents are to be produced is rejected. Suppose the court does not admit or the take on record the document which is inadmissible. As I said, the proper time being to oppose the time at which the documents are to be produced. Suppose if the court upholds the objection of the opposing party and rejects that document, then what has a judge to do? The judge has to do are the same responsibility as in the case of production of documents, 4 conditions. And here, not only the number and title of the suit, and also the name of the person, if it is already there, don't make any details. But the details as to why the document sought to be produced is rejected. That reason has to be recorded by way of an endorsement on the very same document. And as and when that document is rejected, then this document has to be returned to the party who has filed it. Not only endorsement, just like in the case of admission of document, has to be made in the very same document and the same to be returned to the party. That is spoken of in subclass 6 or subsection subrule 6 of order 13. And this is also subject matter of a case reported in AR 2003 Bombay 487. Kindly read this judgment also. And return of admitted documents. Whether documents which have been admitted as evidence, which has been admitted in evidence can be returned. Yes, it can be returned. And what are the conditions? Suppose if the documents are necessary for the person who has produced it, then he has to apply for the same saying why he wants back the documents. That is spoken of in subsection, subrule 9 of rule order 13. And the court has been given a power to impound the documents. Certain impound means that the court will withhold that document produced by a party. Suppose if it is an illegal document, a document which should not have been found a place in the hands of the party, then the court will detain that document in its custody. It will not give back the document. But I don't know what are those documents. The court normally impound those documents. But anyway, the court has power to withhold the documents produced by the party. Therefore, it is not material. But anyway, you take into account the courts have the power to withhold the documents produced by a party for reasons which may be recorded. But except in cases where the documents are impounded, or except when a document is impounded, the parties are at liberty to ask for the return of the documents. What are the conditions for getting return of those documents? And the party can receive back the documents after the disposal of the case. After the disposal of the case, there are 2 or 3 occasions on which it can be received. After disposal of the case, suppose if there is no appeal provided as against the decree of judgment passed in that suit, and the party who produced the document wants it, then he can apply for it and obtain the sale. And then the next is the suit is disposed of. and in respect of which an appeal provided. And the party against whom that decree has been passed has not chosen to file an appeal. Either appeal provides time limit over within which the persons aggrieved has not filed an appeal, or any person who has provision is there for appeal, an appeal is filed and the appeal is also disposed of, then in those cases, the court will permit return of those documents. But in cases where appeal is not provided, it can. And also if appeal is provided, the court has to wait till the appeal period is over. And if the court comes to the conclusion that the aggrieved person has not filed an appeal, and if it is clear, evident that no appeal has been filed, even after the expiry of the period for appeal, then the court will direct return of the documents. And here, document can be returned not only to the party, and there may be occasions where this document might have been produced by witnesses who are not party to the suit. Therefore, these persons who are not party to the suit can also obtain their documents in case they have filed it. They can also move the court by filing an application and get back their documents. Therefore, not only the party who has produced their documents and also witnesses who have produced their documents, irrespective of the relationship between the parties, they can always apply for return of the documents. And provided in case any person wants a return of the document, a party to the suit, there is a difference between the mode of applying. And here, if he is a party to the suit, either plaintiff or the defendant, then they can also get back their document, provided the parties furnish a certified copy of the very same document which they want to get back. They can apply for a certified copy of that original document which they have produced, and the original copy of the document should be replaced by the certified copy. Therefore, in case a party wants their document, then it has to be replaced by a certified copy. Suppose in case a person who is not a party, then obviously you all know a person who is not a party cannot apply for a certified copy. But they can ask for return of their documents. Here also, they can give a copy of that document, and the copy of the document will be taken as a original copy of that document by making necessary endorsement by an officer of the court who verifies the document and also find it that it is the true copy of that document. Then that document, though it is not a certified copy, though that certified copy cannot be obtained, that document will be replaced, and original document will be given back to the party. Therefore, the document given as a copy has to be verified by an officer of the court, and if he certifies that it is the true copy of the original, then it will be there. It will be kept in the bundle of the case, and the original document will be given back. But in all these cases, either a party to the suit or and also a third party or a witness, in case the documents are given back, then they have to give an undertaking that in case the court requires the production of the original document, then they have to undertake that they will return as and when the court requires it. This an undertaking should be given. Then one condition or one circumstances under which the court will not return the document, original document. That is, when a document is now declared invalid. Only for that purpose, a suit has been filed for declaring a particular document invalid. Then the court declares, suppose on evidence or accepting the contention of the plaintiff, if the court invalidates a document, then that document will not be returned at all to the other side or to the person who has returned it, because that document will be of no use once it is set aside, or once it is declared null and void or illegal. Then that document will not be given back to the party because it is of no use. It has no legal force at all. Therefore, if the document is given back to the party, it may be capable of misuse. It can be misused also. Therefore, it will remain in the custody of the court. It will form part of the record. That document will never be stand over to the person who has produced it. And in every case of return of documents, a receipt has to be given by the party who has received the document. Then court may require the production of the documents from other courts also. This is spoken of in Order 13, Rule 10. Suppose if the court wants a record, but the record has to be produced by either of the parties. But unfortunately, the record is not in the custody of the party, but it is in the custody of the court in any other suit. In those cases, if the court is satisfied that the record or the certified copy of that document cannot be obtained in time, that will delay the production of those documents, or sometimes it may be impossible also to get the document back or a certified copy. If the court is satisfied, then the court itself will call for that record from the other courts, or from the very word used in that subclass is, or sub rule is, from any other court. You kindly take note. The court can call for the records from any other court for the purpose of deciding a case that is brought before it. From any other court means not only the civil court, but also from the criminal court also. Therefore, the civil court is given ample power under this particular provision. It can not only call for the records from other civil courts where the records are kept, or in the very same court also. So in the very same court where the suit is pending, the court can always direct the office to produce the records of that another case, and also produce the records from other courts, other civil courts. But when the wording is this, from any other court, it includes criminal court also. It can get the documents, direct the documents from the for the production of the documents from the criminal courts also. Therefore, the scope of this provision is very, very wide. And next topic is settlement of issues. Order 14. This is also an important provision, settlement of issues. Then you have come across the pleadings by way of plaint and also the written statement. In case the written statement does not give any proper answer, and also the objection is very vague, the court is given power even to decree the suit, because there is no proper denial. I have given you some case laws also. Suppose if the objection is very proper, apt, then court has to necessarily decide the dispute. The dispute court will ascertain only from reading both the plaint and also the written statement. But nowadays, the court requires the parties or the advocates appearing for either side to give a draft issue. The draft issues are produced by the counsel for both the parties as an aid to the court for the purpose of framing real issues. It will help the court. Therefore, they require the production of draft issues from the counsel for both the parties. But here, it is the responsibility of the court. Finally, it rests on the court to frame proper issues for the determination of the case that is brought before it. And here, the court has to read very minutely the pleadings, both in the plaint and also the written statement. And these these issues can be framed on a question of law as well as on a question of fact also. Suppose there may be objections by the defendant based on facts also. And it may, in those cases, it may become a issue or subject of an issue in respect of the corresponding claim. Therefore, it will be taken as an issue on facts. Sometimes the claim of the plaintiff will be opposed on the question of law also. In those cases, a legal issue has to be framed, or an issue on law has to be framed. Therefore, in cases where the objection is proper and also direct, clear, not vague, that in those cases, the court will, after applying its mind, the court has to apply its mind and frame the issue. The issues may be based on question of law and also based on question of facts. On both cases or on both instances, the court can frame issues. And the issues may be of two kinds, issues of fact and issues of law. And one has to raise material proposition of facts and also material proposition of law. And it can be equally objected to by the defendant. Therefore, if a material proposition of fact and a material proposition of law is opposed by the defendant, then it will become a subject for issues. Therefore, the issues will arise only from the pleadings of both the parties. And at the first hearing of the suit, the court shall, after reading the plain and written statement, will frame its own issues. Of course, in modern days or in our times, only the advocates are requested to give draft issues. They have to frame the issues by themselves. But court will, after perusing both the parties, will be required to produce that draft issues. But on going through that draft issues, the court will arrive at proper issues. The court will by itself frame rules, issues. Then it will be treated as if the court has framed the issues. It is the issues framed by the court. And the importance of framing issues is stated in a decision reported in, kindly take down, 2010 14 SEC 301. 2010 14 SEC page 301. And what is the responsibility of the court after framing issues? After framing issues, then the court has to go for trial, direct the parties to get ready for the trial. And after trial, the court is required to render its verdict on all issues. This is the norm. I am going to explain to you certain exceptions to it also. But the norms being that once issues are framed, the court is expected to render its verdict on all the issues framed by it. It cannot omit any issue. But here, the CPC itself speaks about the three kinds of issues. One is issues of law and issues of fact. We have already come across in this in order 14. And then is existence of preliminary issue. I am going to speak about, or I am going to explain what is that preliminary issue. And then the next issue is the existence of matters, kindly take down, existence of matters directly in issue. Have you heard this word earlier? Matters directly in issue. You might have heard it when I explained the principle of res judicata under section 11 of CPC. Section 11 of CPC speaks about bar of suit by the provisions of the principle called res judicata. If a case is already decided, wherein the issues raised are in substantially and directly in issue in the earlier suit, then the second suit will not be entertained. It's a bar. Therefore, the CPC speaks about the three kinds of issues. One, the first issues, both issues of fact, issues of law, preliminary issue, and this matters directly and substantially in issue in the earlier case. These are three issues. But this sub rule 2, kindly take down, sub-rule 2 of order 14 speaks about preliminary issue. When I said that the court should address itself to all the issues, it should not omit. But sub-rule 2 says, notwithstanding the fact there is a preliminary issues, and by deciding that preliminary issue, the suit can be disposed of, the court is not permitted. Suppose there are 4 or 5 issues, including issues of fact and the issues of law. But when looking into the pleadings and also the evidence by way of document and also oral evidence, if the court looks into it and court in the mind comes to the conclusion that by the disposal of one issue or by dealing with one issue as a preliminary issue, all the entire claim in the suit can be disposed of, or entire dispute can be disposed of, the court is not permitted. Here the court is required to deal with all the issues and render its verdict on all the issues, even though by deciding a particular issue as a preliminary issue, the suit can be disposed of. There's a bar. The court cannot short circuit the trial by deciding one issue that is called preliminary issue. That way, please take down. Here also there is a minute exception. There is also a minute exception. Then if there are both questions of law, a minute exception, kindly apply your mind also. Kindly hear me very minutely, keenly. If there are both issues of law and issues of facts, and if by taking up the issues of law, the court can dispose of the case, then the court can dispose of that legal issues alone. But here also, the CPC carves out another exception. Not all the issues of law, only those issues of law that relates to jurisdiction of court. Kindly take down. Jurisdiction of court and also bar of suit. When the court frames issues, both issues of law and both issues of fact, though in the earlier subclass, earlier sub-rule, there's a bar on the court to short circuit the trial and decide the case on the question of preliminary issue alone. That is not possible. But here also, when you read the next provision, you will come across an exception. That it can be called even preliminary objection also, or preliminary issue also. But that preliminary issue is restricted to question of law. And that question of law is also further restricted to two aspects, or two objections based on the question of law. That is, issues relating to the jurisdiction of court and issues relating to the bar created by law. Suppose if the suit can be disposed of by deciding these two issues of law relating to jurisdiction and also relating to bar created by law, the court is at liberty to dispose of the case by deciding those two aspects. Either an issue is framed relating to the jurisdiction and an issue framed relating to a bar created by a law, then the court can short circuit the entire trial, restricting itself to the determination of to these two objections. Therefore, you read it minutely. Therefore, you can understand it when you sit and read it minutely. And I will refer you to certain decisions reported in 2012 5 CTC 705 and 2001 2 CTC 411, 2002 2 CTC 513. 3 case laws For your convenience, I may read once over again. 2012, 5 CTC, 705. 2001, 2 CTC, 411. And the last, 2002, 2 CTC, 513. And in cases where these preliminary objections are taken, in the case of issues of law, that too restricted to two instances, and if those issues are taken up, then the framing of issues in respect of other material facts can be postponed, or the decision on the other issues can be postponed. That is the word used. Therefore, it can take up for trial only those two issues, jurisdiction and also bar of suit. Either one, if it is present, or both are present, it can take up for trial those two issues, and the rest of the issues can be postponed. Suppose if the court finds that objection based on the issue of law is sustainable, suit will be dismissed. If the objection based on the question of bar created by a law, if it is found correct, and if it is sustainable, the suit will be dismissed. Therefore, the question of deciding other issues will not arise. And materials from which issues may be framed. What are the materials? The pleadings of the parties. That means the plaint and also the written statement. That is the written statement. Pleadings has to be looked into by the court, and also the documents filed by the parties. When the documents filed by the parties also will throw certain light on the merit of the case, the court will see the documents also, and on the entire conspectus of the pleadings as well as the documentary evidence, the court will frame issues. This is provided in sub-rule 3 of order 14. And when I said this proposition, the court has to look into the pleadings, plain written statement and the document. It cannot frame an issue which is not based on any of these aspects. If it is not based on pleadings, and if it is not based on any evidence, documentary evidence, then court cannot go away from these parameters and frame a different issue, a issue which is alien to the suit. That is not permitted. The issues that will not arise on the basis of the pleadings and also the documentary evidence, then the court has no right at all, no power at all to frame an issue not based on the pleadings. That is decided in AR 1968, Supreme Court 534. Then having said all this, you have to understand that the court has ample power. Court always is reserved with ample powers to meet with any exigencies. You might have come across various provisions conferring power on the civil court. The power of the court is not restricted in any way, because after all, this civil procedure is a procedure framed in order to render justice or in order to advance the cause of justice. Therefore, if any technicality that stands in the way of advancing the cause of justice, rendering justice, all these restrictions, prohibitions, roadblocks are all removed by conferring on the civil court ample powers or plenary powers. Therefore, here also, having said all these restrictions, prohibitions, even beyond that, the court has power to strike out issues already framed. Even the court might have framed the issues, but during the course of hearing or when it applies its mind later, and also even while rendering the judgment or writing the judgment, if the court comes to the conclusion certain issues are not necessary, immaterial, then the court can always strike down that issue and confine itself to the issues that are left. Or with the issues there, minus the issues already deleted or struck out, the court can render its verdict based on the remaining issues. And this is provided under sub rule 5 of rule 14. And the word is, the court may at any time before passing a decree strike out any issue that appears to it to be wrongly framed or introduced, or even the court can correct its own mistake. It is always there. The court can correct its mistake anytime. Suppose it might have been there. It might have been framed by the court itself. But later on, if found that the particular issue is not correctly framed, then it will strike out that issue. Then order 15, disposal of suit. Today I close for the day.